Name the American general who was handed an infantry division that had come apart in the New Georgia jungle, a division whose own corps commander had just reported that it looked ready to fold up, and who had that division standing on the Munda airfield 7 days later. Name the general who put 2 infantry divisions ashore on Leyte and had their objectives in hand inside 12 days at a cost of 2,095 casualties against nearly 7,000 Japanese dead. Name the general who took a corps into the southern half of Okinawa and broke the Shuri Line, the strongest fortified position American ground troops faced anywhere in the Pacific War. Same man. All 3. You cannot name him. That is not because you have not read the books. Most of you in this audience have read more of them than I have, and you will catch me if I get a regimental designation wrong. You cannot name him because he is not in them, not in the way he should be. He is not on the covers. He is not in the documentaries. When his name does surface at all, it surfaces attached to something else entirely, something that happened after the shooting stopped, in a country that almost no American in uniform had thought about 6 weeks earlier. Here's the part that should bother you. In the autumn of 1945, the American Corps commanders were coming home, some of them to parades, some of them to Army commands, some of them to Washington, where the next 30 years of the United States Army were being drafted by officers who had spent the entire war within reach of a telephone. And one of them, a man with 3 distinguished service crosses, a man who had spent something close to 30 months in continuous command of troops in contact with the enemy, was sitting on the second floor of a granite colonial office building in Seoul, behind a desk that had belonged to a Japanese governor general the week before, trying to run a country of 20 million people he had never studied, in a language nobody on his staff could speak, with nothing in writing from his own government telling him what the United States wanted Korea to become. He was there for 3 years. He asked to be relieved. He was not relieved. And when the Korean War came, 5 years later, and the United States Army needed somebody who understood that terrain, that constabulary, those politicians and those roads, the Army gave him a training command in Georgia and left him there. His name was John Reed Hodge. And the question of how he ended up behind that desk is not a story about one man's bad luck. It is a story about what an army is for, and what happens when a government hands one a job it never built the Army to do. A lot of you in the comments have been asking for more Pacific coverage, and a number of you have personal connections to this one, Korea veterans especially. I want to do it justice. Start with what the record actually says about Hodge, because the record is thin, and a fair amount of what is in it will not survive contact with a search engine. You will find it repeated in a dozen places that Time magazine called him the Patton of the Pacific. I went looking for that. I could not find it. Not the issue, not the date, not the article. What I did find is that the phrase Patton of the Pacific was applied in print to Admiral Joseph Clark and separately to Admiral William Halsey, and that it does not appear as a Hodge label in the serious scholarship. It is not in Stephen Toft's study of Marshall's commanders. It is not in Alan Millett's work on Korea. I am flagging that on camera because this channel does not launder a quotation, just because it flatters the subject. If somebody watching has the issue and the page number, I will correct it in a pinned comment, and I will thank you for it. Until then, treat it as apocryphal. That matters more than it sounds like it matters, because the borrowed nickname is doing a job that a real body of writing should be doing and is not. Hodge has no biography of the sort Terry Allen finally got. He has no champion of the sort Carlo D'Este was for Patton. What he has, instead, is a second-hand slogan and a reputation assembled almost entirely out of the 3 years after his war ended. And here is the shape of the gap. Search the standard American memory of the Second World War, and you will find Corps commanders who fought one campaign and are household names. You will find Army commanders who spent most of the war in England and have statues. What you will not find is the officer who fought at Guadalcanal, then New Georgia, then Bougainville, then Leyte, then Okinawa, in that order, without a break long enough to matter. At his rank, in that theater, that record is close to unmatched. In popular memory, it is close to invisible. I think the reason is simple and unflattering. American memory of this war is organized around Europe, and inside the Pacific, it is organized around the Navy and the Marine Corps. An Army Corps commander in the South and Central Pacific sits inside a blind spot that is almost geometrically perfect. Add a post-war assignment that everybody agrees ended badly, and the man disappears entirely. If you're finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. Now, back to Hodge. He was born in Golconda, Illinois, on June 12, 1893. Pope County on the Ohio River, in the far southern tip of the state, geographically closer to Nashville than to Chicago. The family was not poor, and it was not comfortable. He went to Southern Illinois Teachers College at Carbondale, then to the University of Illinois, and he taught school. Hold on to that, because the men running the United States Army in 1945 were overwhelmingly graduates of the military academy, and Hodge was not one of them. He came in through an officer training program at Fort Sheridan in 1917 and was commissioned as second lieutenant of infantry. No academy ring, no class of 1915, no network. He went to France with the 61st Infantry, 6th Division, and served in France and Luxembourg in 1918 and 1919. He made captain. He did nothing that anyone bothered to record. Andrew Salmon, writing about him in the Korea Times, put it plainly and correctly that Hodge achieved no great distinction in the First World War. That is the honest assessment. He was one of tens of thousands of competent young officers in a war that ended before most of them got a chance to be anything more than competent. Then came the Interwar Army, which is where the American Officer Corps of 1944 was actually manufactured. Hodge ran the full circuit. Professor of military science at Mississippi Agricultural and Mechanical College from 1921 to 1925, the infantry school at Fort Benning, graduating in 1926, a tour in Hawaii, the Command and General Staff School, graduating in 1934, the Army War College, and the Air Corps Tactical School, which almost no infantryman troubled with, and which tells you something real about how this man's mind worked. There is a detail there worth pausing on. George Marshall arrived at Benning as assistant commandant in 1927 and spent 5 years rebuilding how the Army taught tactics, and the officers who passed through his hands in those years became famous inside the institution as the men on Marshall's list. Hodge graduated in 1926. He missed it by a year. He was never a Marshall protege in the way Bradley was, in the way Collins was, in the way a dozen of the men who ended the war with Army groups were. Now look at the promotion dates, because they contain the entire interwar Army in one line. Captain in 1920, Major in 1935, Lieutenant Colonel in 1940, 15 years a captain. That was the American Army between the wars, and it is the reason the men who came out the far side of it were, almost without exception, extremely difficult to impress and almost impossible to hurry. When the United States entered the war, Hodge was Chief of Staff of the 7th Corps under Robert Richardson in California. He made temporary brigadier general in June of 1942, and from that point he was almost never off the line again. What sort of officer was he? Blunt to the edge of rudeness, physically hard and hard on subordinates, not a courtier, not a self-promoter, and not a man who made himself convenient to war correspondents. Salmon described him as a lean-faced, fair-haired figure in starched fatigues, and that is very nearly the sum total of the personal color available on him. He generated almost no anecdotes, in an army that produced Patton and MacArthur. Generating no anecdotes is itself a kind of statement. In my view, that is the first thread of this entire story. Hodge was the precise opposite of a political general. No patron in Washington, no press relationship, no memoir in him, and he never wrote one. He was, in the most literal sense, an infantryman's infantryman, and the American system of 1945 was superb at consuming such men and almost completely uninterested in protecting them. Now, the combat record, because everything that comes after 1945 has to be measured against it. He went to Guadalcanal as assistant division commander of the 25th Infantry Division, the Tropic Lightning, under Lawton Collins. The division arrived in the closing weeks of 1942 and fought through the final offensive that secured the island in January of 1943, the drive across the ridges west of the Matanikau that the soldiers named the Galloping Horse and the Seahorse for the shapes they made on an aerial photograph. That is where Hodge learned the Pacific. And it is worth noting that his first education in this war came under Collins, who would go on to command the 7th Corps from Utah Beach to the Elbe, and to serve as Chief of Staff of the Army. Whatever else you say about Hodge, he learned his trade from one of the 2 or 3 best division commanders the United States produced in the entire war, then New Georgia. This is the episode that made his reputation inside the Army, and it is the one almost nobody outside the Army has ever heard of. The objective was the Japanese airfield at Munda Point, on the southwest coast of New Georgia in the Central Solomons. The 43rd Infantry Division went in, a New England National Guard outfit with regiments from Connecticut, Maine, Rhode Island, and Vermont, and the attack stalled. Then it did something worse than stall. It came apart, not in the sense of men running, in the sense of a formation losing the ability to function as a formation. The terrain was coral rainforest with no roads, a single muddy trail, and visibility measured in feet. The Japanese fought at night, infiltrating between and behind American positions, and the psychological effect on troops in their first campaign was catastrophic. Men fired at noises. Men fired at each other. Units stopped moving because moving meant losing contact with the unit on the flank, and losing contact at night in that jungle meant being killed by your own side. The numbers are the story here, and they are numbers that do not belong in the Pacific War at all. Between June 30th and September 30th of 1943, more than 2,500 American soldiers in that operation were evacuated with what the medical officers of the day called war neurosis. 2,500. That is a casualty category out of the Western Front in 1917, and it was happening on an island in the Solomons that most Americans could not have located on a globe. Millard Harmon, commanding Army forces in the South Pacific, went to Halsey and got a Corps headquarters inserted into the operation. Oscar Griswold in the 14th Corps took charge on July 16th. Griswold looked at the 43rd Division and reported to his theater commander that it seemed ready to fold up. 5 words. That is a Corps commander telling his boss, in writing, that an American infantry division has ceased to exist as a fighting organization. John Hester was relieved of the division. The official reason recorded was exhaustion of combat, which is the phrase armies reach for when they need to remove a man without destroying him. And on July 29, 1943, John Hodge was given the 43rd Infantry Division. Munda Airfield fell on August 5th. 7 days. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the sort of thing that gets oversold by people who need a hero. Hodge did not personally win that campaign in a week. Griswold had already reorganized the entire Corps effort. Fresh regiments from the 37th and 25th Divisions were feeding in. Artillery was finally being used the way it should have been used from the start, and the Japanese defense was reaching its own breaking point. But the record is the record. A division that a Corps commander had written off as finished was, within a week of Hodge taking it over, standing on the objective. And it remained a functioning combat division for the remaining 2 years of the war, which is the part that actually measures a commander. The total cost of the Munda Drive from July 2nd onward was roughly 4,994 Americans killed or wounded, against about 4,683 Japanese dead. The 43rd Division's own share came to 538 killed or dead of wounds, and 1,942 wounded. John Miller's volume in the Army's Green Book series on the reduction of Rabaul is where those figures live. And if you have not read it, it is one of the most unsparing official histories the United States government ever published about its own performance. And then it got worse for Hodge personally, in the specific way that success gets worse for a certain kind of officer. The Army had discovered something useful about him. He became the man you sent when a formation was broken. That is a compliment, and it is also a sentence. Officers who acquire that reputation do not get the clean assignments. They get the ones that are already burning. Hold that thought, because in 2 years, it is going to explain everything. Next came the Americal Division on Bougainville in 1944. Sources differ on the exact date he took the division over, and I would rather flag that than paper over it, so consider it flagged. What is not in dispute is the situation. The American strategy on Bougainville was not to take the island. It was to seize a perimeter around Empress Augusta Bay at Cape Tarokana, build airfields inside it, and use those airfields to help strangle the great Japanese base at Rabaul. The Japanese still had the bulk of Harukichi Hyakutake's 17th Army on Bougainville, and they were not going to accept an American enclave on their island indefinitely. The American Division relieved the 3rd Marine Division on that perimeter at the end of 1943. In March of 1944, Hyakutake came for it, in what the Americans called the Second Battle of Torokina, running from March 8th to March 25th. The fighting concentrated on 3 pieces of high ground: Hill 700 and Cannon Hill in the 37th Division sector, and Hill 260 in the Americal sector, where the Americans had built an observation post in a banyan tree roughly 125 feet tall, and where the Japanese spent the better part of a battalion trying to take it away from them. Hyakutake committed somewhere between 15,000 and 19,000 men. He lost more than 5,000 killed. American losses were a small fraction of that. It was one of the cleanest defensive victories of the entire Pacific War, and it is the kind of result that gets a division commander noticed by an army commander who is shopping for corps commanders, which is exactly what happened. Hodge was given the newly activated 24th Corps. Now, before we get to Leyte, one detail that almost nobody mentions, and that I think is the most important single fact in the first half of this story. The 24th Corps was not supposed to go to Leyte. It was loaded and staged for an operation against Yap in the Western Carolines. Halsey's carriers then swept the central Philippines in September of 1944 and reported that Japanese air strength there was far weaker than anyone had believed. The whole Pacific timetable was torn up. YAP was canceled. And the 24th Corps, already at sea, already combat loaded for a completely different island against a completely different plan, was diverted to the Philippines and handed to Walter Kruger's 6th Army. Remember that. It is going to happen to this Corps again. The second time, it is going to change the 20th century. The Corps went ashore on Leyte on October 20th, 1944, with the 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions in the assault. By November 1st, the two divisions had taken their objectives at a cost of 2,095 casualties and 111 missing, having killed something on the order of 6,980 Japanese. Then the campaign turned into the thing that Leyte is actually remembered for by the men who were there, which is mud, the Leyte Valley, Dagami, Shoestring Ridge, where a single reinforced American battalion held against a Japanese division's worth of pressure. The Ormoc Corridor in a monsoon, in mountains. Against reinforcements the Japanese kept feeding in by sea long after the campaign should have been over. In the final drive on Ormoc, the 77th Division killed roughly 1,506 Japanese at a cost of 123 killed, 329 wounded, and 13 missing. Hamlin Cannon's Green Book volume on Leyte, subtitled The Return to the Philippines, has that campaign in the granular detail this audience likes, and it does not flatter anybody, including MacArthur's headquarters, which spent the campaign announcing that it was over. Hodge received an Army Distinguished Service Medal for Leyte, and then he was given the assignment that should have made him a name your grandchildren would recognize: Okinawa. On April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, the 10th Army under Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. put 4 divisions ashore on the Hagushi beaches. Roy Geiger's 3rd Amphibious Corps, 2 Marine divisions, turned north. John Hodge's 24th Corps, the 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions, turned south. The landing was almost unopposed. American losses on landing day came to 28 killed or missing and 104 wounded, which, for an amphibious assault against a Japanese garrison on what was legally Japanese home soil in 1945, was so low that the assault troops assumed the intelligence had been wrong. The intelligence had not been wrong. What had happened was that a Japanese commander had made a decision, and it is worth understanding that decision because it defines everything Hodge's Corps did for the next 11 weeks. Mitsuru Ushijima commanded the Japanese 32nd Army. Imperial General Headquarters had stripped him of his best formation, the 9th Division, and shipped it to Formosa, and had not replaced it. Ushijima's operations officer, Hiromichi Yahara, argued that with the force remaining, there was no possibility of holding the airfields or contesting the beaches, and that any attempt to do so would simply feed the 32nd Army into American naval gunfire. Yahara won that argument. The Japanese would give up the north, they would give up the beaches, they would concentrate in the coral limestone of southern Okinawa, on reverse slopes and caves and family tombs and hand-cut tunnel systems, with every position covered by another position and every approach registered for mortars, and they would make the Americans excavate them one at a time. The cost to the Americans would be measured in weeks, and the weeks were the entire point, because every week the 10th Army spent on Okinawa was another week the Kamikaze Corps had to work on the fleet lying offshore with nowhere to go. That is the ground Hodge's Corps walked into. The Makinado Line first, then Kakazu Ridge, then the Shuri Line proper, anchored on Shuri Castle, the ancient seat of the Ryukyuan kings, with Conical Hill on the eastern flank and Sugarloaf on the western. Buckner coined the phrase that became the 10th Army's method: blowtorch and corkscrew. The blowtorch was flame, from man-packed throwers and from tank-mounted throwers, to burn the defenders out of the cave mouths. The corkscrew was demolition, to seal the cave permanently with whatever was left inside it. That phrase has been quoted so many times that it has gone soft. Put it back into the physical world for 1 second. Consider what it actually described as a daily activity for a 19-year-old from Ohio. Then consider that it was the operating doctrine of an entire American field army for 2.5 months. Here is where the numbers stop being background and start being the argument. In the 4 days, from April 19th to April 22nd, 1945, attacking the outer Shuri defenses, Hodge's 24th Corps took 2,851 casualties. 4 days. The newly committed 27th Infantry Division was mauled at Kakazu Ridge and lost 22 of its 30 tanks in a single action. And this is the part the popular accounts skate past, so let me say it directly. Okinawa was a frontal attritional assault, repeated, into the strongest part of a prepared position by a commander who had chosen not to maneuver. The post-war historical analysis of the 27th Division held by the New York State Military Museum says so in language that leaves no room for interpretation, describing Buckner attacking repeatedly into the strength of the Shuri Line in an operation reminiscent of the First World War. That is not a modern revisionist with an axe. That is the institution's own review of its own campaign. There was an alternative on the table, and it had serious backing. Andrew Bruce, commanding the 77th Division, argued for a second amphibious landing on the Minnetonka beaches in the south, behind the Shuri Line, to unhinge the entire position from the rear. Bruce had just done exactly that at Ormoc on Leyte, and it had worked. Marine leadership was sympathetic, so at points was Nimitz. Buckner refused. His reasons were not stupid ones. The southern beaches were poor, backed by cliffs, with no port and no room to build up. The supply situation was already strained to the limit by the kamikaze campaign against the shipping, and Buckner said openly that he was not going to manufacture another Anzio, only worse, with a second American force pinned against the water and unable to be supported. I want to be scrupulous about where responsibility sits, because this audience will hold me to it and should. The decision to refuse the end run was Buckner's, not Hodge's. Hodge was a corps commander executing an army commander's concept, and no corps commander in that army was going to overturn it. But Hodge was the corps commander whose divisions did the dying under that concept, and on the available record, he did not push hard for an alternative. He was a straight-ahead soldier, it was a straight-ahead plan, and the fit between the man and the method was comfortable. That is my honest criticism of him as a fighting general, and I think it is the fair one. Hodge was superb at two things: making broken formations fight again, and grinding methodically through prepared defenses without losing cohesion. He was not an operational artist. He was not Truscott. He was not John Wood. He was not the man who found the flank nobody else had seen. He was the man you handed the frontal problem to when there was no flank, and on Okinawa, in the judgment of the officer above him, there was no flank. He was also hard on subordinate commanders in ways that produced lasting friction, and his handling of the 27th Division in particular left scars that division's veterans carried to their reunions for the next 40 years. If you have a 27th Division family, you have heard about it, and I am not going to pretend the grievance was invented. There is one more Okinawa moment that belongs to Hodge and almost never gets credited to him. At the beginning of May, Isamu Cho, Ushijima's chief of staff, persuaded his commander to abandon Yahara's defensive concept and launch a general counteroffensive. On May 4th, the Japanese came out of their positions and attacked with armor, with amphibious end runs of their own around both flanks, and with the heaviest artillery preparation, the 32nd Army fired in the entire battle. Hodge's corps destroyed it. The counteroffensive cost the Japanese something on the order of 5,000 men in 2 days, and stripped the Shuri Line of exactly the reserves it needed for the fight still to come. Yahara had been right, and Cho had been wrong, and the 32nd Army never recovered. The Shuri Line broke at the end of May. Ushijima and Cho killed themselves in a cave on the Mabuni Escarpment in June. Buckner was killed by a coral fragment thrown up by a Japanese shell on June 18th, the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy fire in the entire war. Geiger took the 10th Army for 5 days, the only Marine ever to command an American field army in combat. And then Joseph Stilwell arrived to take it permanently. Organized resistance ended on June 21st, or 22nd, depending on which account you use, 82 days after the landing. Now the numbers, all in one place, because they are the argument. Total American casualties on Okinawa came to 49,151, of whom 12,520 were killed or missing, and 36,631 were wounded. Hodge's 24th Corps alone accounted for 4,412 killed in action and 17,689 wounded. Add Army non-battle casualties across the campaign, 15,613, a large share of which were men who reached the end of what a human nervous system will absorb. Geiger's 3rd Amphibious Corps took 16,507 battle casualties, 2,779 killed and 13,609 wounded, plus 10,598 non-battle. The Navy, sitting offshore inside the kamikaze storm with nowhere to hide, lost 4,907 killed and 4,824 wounded. 36 ships sunk, 368 damaged, 763 aircraft lost. Japanese dead is disputed, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. The range in serious sources runs from more than 90,000 at the low end to 107,539 at the high end. Okinawan civilian dead is disputed far more sharply, with a commonly cited figure of roughly 100,000 and a defensible range running from about 50,000 to about 150,000. Anybody who hands you a single confident number for Okinawan civilian deaths is telling you more about their politics than about the evidence. And one figure that deserves to stand alone: battle stress losses on Okinawa ran at 48% of the losses caused by enemy fire. For every 2 men shot, 1 man broke. Roy Appleman, James Burns, Russell Googler, and John Stevens laid all of this out in the Army's official volume, Okinawa, The Last Battle, published in 1948. 80 years later, it is still where you start. So that is the officer, and let me put him on the table in one paragraph. Guadalcanal, New Georgia, Bougainville, Leyte, Okinawa. 3 Distinguished Service Crosses, 3 Army Distinguished Service Medals, a Navy Distinguished Service Medal, a Legion of Merit, an Air Medal, a Purple Heart. A lieutenant general at 52 years old, commanding a corps that had just finished the hardest sustained ground campaign of the Pacific War, and that was sitting on Okinawa in July of 1945. Refitting and training for Operation Coronet, the invasion of the Tokyo Plain. Now we get to the question in the title. And the answer is going to make some of you angry, because the answer is not a conspiracy. The answer is considerably worse than a conspiracy. Some context first, because the decision did not come from nowhere. At Cairo in 1943, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek had declared that Korea, a Japanese colony since 1910, would in due course become free and independent. In due course, 4 words, doing an enormous amount of work. Roosevelt's private thinking, discussed at Yalta, ran toward a great power trusteeship over Korea lasting 20 or 30 years on the theory that the Koreans were not ready to govern themselves, a theory that no Korean had been consulted about and that every Korean would have rejected. Then the Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 8, 1945, and Soviet armies came into Manchuria and northern Korea, and the atomic bombs fell, and the Japanese government sued for peace, and the entire American planning schedule for the Pacific collapsed into about 72 hours. On the night of August 10th and August 11th, 1945, in Washington, the State War Navy Coordinating Committee had to tell the Soviets where the American occupation zone in Korea would begin. 2 Army colonels were sent into an adjoining room to work it out. One was Charles Bonesteel III. The other was Dean Rusk, who 20 years later would be Secretary of State. They had about 30 minutes. They did not have a proper military map of Korea. They used a National Geographic map. They looked for a natural geographic line north of Seoul and could not find one. What they found instead was a line of latitude that ran clean across the peninsula, split it roughly in half, and left the capital on the American side, the 38th parallel. Rusk wrote about it himself decades later in his memoir, As I Saw It. His own phrase for the choice was that it had been recommended by 2 tired colonels working late at night. He also wrote that it proved fateful, which is the most restrained sentence any American official has ever composed about a decision that produced a war, a permanent division, and eventually a nuclear-armed dictatorship. Truman approved it on August 14th. The Soviets accepted it on August 16th. No Korean was consulted at any stage, not one. Not the provisional government exiles in Chongqing, not the exiles in the United States, not anybody inside the country. And now the operational question. Having drawn the line, who was going to go and stand on it? The Soviet 25th Army was already moving south through northern Korea. It had been in the war for a week, and it was close. The nearest American ground formation of any size was 600 miles away on Okinawa. That formation was the 24th Corps. That is it. That is the entire selection process. Not merit, not punishment, not MacArthur settling a score with anybody. Geography and shipping capacity. The 24th Corps got Korea because the 24th Corps could physically get to Korea before the Red Army got to Pusan. Second time this corps was reassigned in transit. The first time it cost them Yap and gave them Leyte. The second time it gave them a country. This is the part the official histories glide over, and it is the part I think matters most. We tell ourselves stories about how great institutions arrive at consequential decisions. The actual mechanism here was 2 exhausted staff officers with a magazine map, followed by a corps commander selected because his transports were pointed in the right direction. MacArthur's headquarters issued the order under the occupation plan called Blacklist 40. Hodge and his staff were told, with roughly 2 weeks of notice, that they were going to occupy and govern a country. Understand what the corps actually was, at that moment. By the figures in the Command and General Staff College study of the occupation, the 24th Corps comprised about 62,724 combat soldiers and about 29,076 support soldiers. It had spent the previous 60 days preparing for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. Every man in it had been trained, equipped, organized, briefed, and mentally prepared to conduct the largest opposed amphibious landing in human history against an enemy expected to fight to the last civilian. Now it was going to run a country's railroads. The Corps left Okinawa on September 5th. It arrived off Kamulpo, which we call Incheon, on September 8th. Corps headquarters moved into Seoul on September 9th, and that same day the Japanese forces south of the parallel formally surrendered in the Government General Building, and the Japanese flag came down over Seoul for the first time in 35 years, 28 days from a magazine map to a military government. And then it got worse, and here is where the indictment turns from Washington's haste to Washington's negligence. First, the language. The 24th Corps arrived in Korea with no organic Korean interpreters. None. The Army's own compiled history of the occupation states that while the Corps had a reasonably adequate supply of Japanese translators, in its dealings with Koreans, it had to depend almost entirely on local people for the vital work of interpreting. Think about what that means as a matter of daily governance. Every single conversation between the occupying power and the occupied population passed either through the language of the colonizer the Koreans had just been liberated from, or through untrained, unvetted local volunteers whose political loyalties nobody on the American side could assess, because nobody on the American side could understand what they were saying to each other. You cannot govern a country you cannot hear. Second, the trained personnel. Military government is a specialty, and the United States Army treated it as one. It had a school at Charlottesville, Virginia, and a staging area at Monterey, California, and over 2 years, it had produced thousands of trained civil affairs officers. Those officers had been trained for Germany and for Japan. According to the Command and General Staff College monograph on the occupation, it was against policy to teach Korean at the military government school. Against policy. The first dedicated military government companies did not reach Korea until October of 1945, which is to say after the occupation had begun and after the most consequential early decisions had already been made and could not be unmade. I want to be careful and fair about this one because there is a version of this story circulating in which trained Korea specialists existed and were deliberately diverted to Japan, and the evidence does not support it. The evidence supports something less dramatic and considerably more damning. There were no Korea specialists to divert. The United States government in 1945 had built an enormous, sophisticated, expensive apparatus for administering a defeated Germany and a defeated Japan, and had built essentially nothing for Korea, because until the second week of August of that year, nobody at the policy level had seriously imagined that the United States would be governing Korea. The Command and General Staff College study is candid that historians do not actually know why the teams were not there. That is the honest state of the record. And it is worse than a villain would be. Third, and worst, the policy. Hodge landed with no political directive of any kind. This is documented in the government's own published diplomatic record, the Foreign Relations of the United States series, in Volume 6 of the 1945 collection. A telegram from the last week of August states plainly that no directive with regard to Korea had yet been received in theater. Hodge asked for one. He asked repeatedly. He asked for a policy body to be established at Seoul. He asked for definite instructions as to what the United States wanted the future of Korea to be. He asked for staff officers who actually understood civil government and who knew something about Asia. The basic American policy directive for Korea was a State War Navy Coordinating Committee paper, and it was not even dated until October 13th, 1945. It was sent to Hodge that month. He had by then been the effective government of 20 million people for more than a month, making decisions that would define the political landscape of the peninsula for the rest of the century, with nothing in writing from his own government about what he was supposed to be building. And when the directive finally did arrive, it committed the United States to a multi-power trusteeship over Korea. Not independence, trusteeship. A policy that virtually every Korean political faction, left and right, regarded as colonial rule under a new flag, and a policy that Hodge himself thought was wrong and said so. So the man was given no language, no trained staff, and no policy. Then he was given a policy he believed was a mistake, and then he was told to make it work, and told nothing else for 3 years. Let me put some specifics on what governing actually meant for a Corps staff built to move infantry divisions, because this never makes it into the histories, and it explains everything that followed. The line the two colonels drew did not merely divide a country politically, it cut an economy in half along the single worst possible seam. Almost all of Korea's heavy industry, its hydroelectric generating capacity, and its coal lay north of the parallel. The agricultural south is where the great majority of the people lived. Overnight, the American zone had the mouths, and the Soviet zone had the electricity, and the two zones stopped trading almost immediately. The currency was already going. Bank of Chosen note circulation stood at about 3.5 billion yen in March of 1945. By September 12th of that year, it stood at about 7.5 billion. The Japanese colonial administration had printed money on its way out the door and paid off its obligations in paper, and inflation was running hard before a single American administrator had unpacked a footlocker. The food situation was worse than the harvest figure suggested because a large share of the previous year's grain crop had already been shipped to Japan. There were nearly 400,000 Japanese in the American zone who had to be repatriated, and they were, by the end of 1945, leaving about 1,000 technical specialists behind. Consider what that actually meant. The Japanese colonial system had reserved essentially every position of technical and managerial responsibility for Japanese. Every railway superintendent, every power plant engineer, every bank officer, every senior civil servant. The repatriation of that population, which was morally and politically unavoidable, removed the entire trained managerial class of the country inside 4 months. There was also a cholera epidemic, and there was politics, on a scale that nobody in Seoul had anticipated or was equipped to handle. On September 12, 1945, Hodge invited Korean political groups to send 2 representatives each to meet with him. More than 1,200 people came. 1,200! Sit with that number because it may be the single most useful statistic in this entire episode. 2 representatives per group. 600 political organizations in a country that had been under a colonial police state for 35 years and had been free for 4 weeks. Every suppressed faction, every exile network, every village committee, every ideological splinter of the independence movement, all of it decompressing at once. That was the political landscape the 24th Corps was asked to govern, in a language it could not speak without a policy, with a staff trained to coordinate divisional artillery. Now the trial. Because I said at the top that this channel does not do hero worship, and I meant it. Hodge made decisions in Korea that were entirely his own. Several of them were bad, and the fact that Washington set him up to fail does not erase them. On September 9th, the day of the surrender ceremony, Hodge announced that the Japanese colonial administration, including Governor General Nobuyuki Abe, would remain in place temporarily. His reasoning was administrative. There were no trained Korean officials available because the Japanese had spent 35 years ensuring there were none, and somebody had to keep the trains running and the rice moving and the water clean. The reasoning was not insane. The decision was still indefensible, and the reaction told him so within days. Korean opinion was incandescent. Here was a liberating army whose first official act was to confirm the colonial governor in office. The American press was nearly as bad. Washington reversed it. Abe was gone, replaced by an American, Archibald Arnold. The Japanese bureau chiefs were removed, but a good many former Japanese officials stayed on as advisors, and the Korean perception of the American occupation was set in its first 72 hours and never fully recovered from it. Hodge himself later acknowledged that in those early months he kept an ear turned toward the Japanese more often than toward the Korean. That is his own assessment of his own conduct, and it is an accurate one. There is a remark attributed to him, quoted constantly, that Koreans were the same breed of cat as the Japanese. I want to be precise about the provenance because this quotation has done more than anything else to fix his reputation. It reaches us through the journalist Mark Gain in his book Japan Diary. Gain records Hodge saying it, and also records Hodge attributing the underlying idea to a Japanese general he had spoken with. So it is a real quotation, taken down by a working reporter who was there, but it comes to us secondhand, and inside a specific context that the popular version strips away entirely. Present it, do not hide it. Be honest about where it comes from and what it does and does not prove. The larger charge against Hodge is political, and it is serious. In the 3 weeks between the Japanese surrender and the American arrival, Koreans had not been sitting still. Yo Un-hyung, a nationalist figure with genuine standing across much of the political spectrum, had organized the Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence. And out of it, on September 6th, came a declared Korean People's Republic, supported by a network of local people's committees that had already taken over administration in much of the countryside. It was left-leaning, it was uneven, and it was in some places genuinely revolutionary. It was also, at that moment, the only functioning indigenous political structure in the country. Hodge refused to recognize it. He outlawed the Korean People's Republic on December 12, 1945. The Americans worked instead through the Korean Democratic Party, which possessed two enormous advantages from the standpoint of an occupying headquarters that could not speak the language. Its leaders spoke English, and they were cooperative. They were also landlords, businessmen, and, in a number of cases, men who had made their accommodations with the Japanese and prospered under them. So the occupation, in the entirely understandable act of looking for Koreans it could talk to, ended up elevating precisely the class that most Koreans associated with collaboration, and suppressing the organizations that had actually been governing the villages since August. That is the core of the argument Bruce Cumings makes in the first volume of The Origins of the Korean War, subtitled Liberation and the Emergence of Separate Regimes. Cumings contends that the American occupation's reflexive anti-leftism and its dependence on discredited elites did not simply mishandle Korean politics, but actively manufactured the conditions for civil war. It is a formidable book. It has shaped two generations of scholarship, and this channel is not going to wave it away because it is uncomfortable for the American side of the story. The situation got worse from there, and Hodge's position got worse with it. Syngman Rhee came back in October of 1945. Kim Koo came back in November. Neither man had any intention of being administered. Then, in December, the Moscow Agreement among the foreign ministers announced a joint commission and a trusteeship of up to 5 years, and the country detonated. Left and right, for once, agreed on something, which was that trusteeship was an insult. Hodge was now enforcing a policy he had opposed against a population that regarded it as a betrayal on behalf of a government that would not explain itself. The Joint Commission with the Soviets met in 1946 and again in 1947 and deadlocked both times. The autumn of 1946 brought a railway strike around Busan and Daegu that grew into a general uprising across the southern provinces, suppressed by the Korean National Police, the same institution the occupation had inherited from the Japanese and only partly purged, alongside the newly organized constabulary. The suppression was brutal, and it hardened anti-American feeling permanently. The Jeju Uprising began in 1948, and the counterinsurgency that followed killed something on the order of 30,000 islanders and destroyed more than half the villages on that island, although the worst of that came after Hodge had gone, and under the new Korean government. That is the case against the man. Now the defense, and then my verdict. Alan Millett, in The War for Korea, 1945 to 1950, subtitled A House Burning, gives us the most serious institutional assessment available, and his Hodge is an earnest and capable administrator hamstrung by a lack of support from Washington. James Mattray has written that the occupation began with very little preparation and was conducted by officials ignorant of Korea's history and culture. James Schnabel's Army volume on policy and direction in the Korean War arrives at a similar place from an entirely different direction. And if you want the contemporary view from inside the machine, Grant Meade's American Military Government in Korea, published in 1951 by a man who served in it, is still worth tracking down. The defense also has concrete achievements to point at, and they almost never get mentioned. The military government substantially cut back the colonial police apparatus it inherited. It got a cholera epidemic under control. It moved enough rice to prevent a famine in a zone that had simultaneously lost its industrial half, its managerial class, and its currency stability. It stood up a Korean administrative class from nothing. Those are not small accomplishments, and they were achieved by infantry officers, improvising with no manual. So here is my verdict, and I think it is the only one the evidence will actually carry. Both sides of this argument are right about different things, and the heat of the argument has obscured the fact that they agree about the thing that matters most. Cumings is right that Hodge made real choices with real consequences, and that those choices tilted the political ground in southern Korea toward the right and toward the men who had done well under the Japanese. Millett is right that Hodge made those choices inside a vacuum that his own government had created and then declined to fill. Both propositions are true simultaneously. Hodge is responsible for what he did. Washington is responsible for the fact that a corps commander was doing it at all, and that is the systemic indictment. So let me name the pattern rather than the man. The United States Army of 1945 was the most effective organization in the world at the destruction of enemy armies. It had built, at staggering expense, an unmatched machinery for producing, supplying, transporting, and applying violence at continental scale. What it had not built, because the American political system had never decided that it wanted one, was any comparable machinery for governing what was left when the violence stopped. And where it had built one, it had built it only for the places American planners had been thinking about for years. So the institution did what institutions always do when a problem arrives outside their design. It reached for the nearest available competent man, told him to figure it out, gave him no language, no policy, no specialists, and no political cover, and then, when the results were exactly what any honest planner would have predicted, allowed his name to be the one attached to the failure. That is not a Korea story. That is what happens in every large organization when a problem arrives that nobody owns. The work does not go to the person best suited to it. It goes to the person who is closest and cannot say no. And if you have spent a career inside a large organization, you have watched this happen, and you have watched the person who got handed the impossible job become the person whose file it went into. Here is the operational detail that I think proves the point more effectively than any argument I can make. Consider what Hodge's headquarters was actually built to do. A Corps headquarters in 1945 was one of the most refined instruments the American Army had ever produced. It could take 4 infantry divisions, a Corps artillery group, engineers, signal, ordnance, quartermaster, and medical units, and orchestrate all of it across 100 miles of front against a first-class enemy. Its fire direction system could bring the guns of an entire corps onto a single map, coordinate inside of minutes. Hodge's staff had done precisely that at Leyte and again at Okinawa against the best defensive engineers on Earth. Now hand that staff a rice price, hand it a currency in free fall, a newspaper licensing regime, 600 political parties, a national police force that every Korean associates with torture, a repatriation program moving 400,000 people out, and hundreds of thousands of returning Koreans in, a cholera outbreak, a coal shortage, and a border it does not control and cannot close. Then take away its ability to understand what anyone is saying. There is no failure of character in that mismatch. There's a failure of imagination, and it did not happen in Seoul. It happened in Washington, in rooms where nobody was ever going to have to look a Korean in the face. And you can measure that failure precisely because the United States did the same job twice more in the same 18 months, and did it competently both times. Germany got years of planning, a written directive, a trained occupation staff, and a settled policy on what the country was supposed to become. Japan got a general who had been thinking about the problem since 1942, a functioning imperial bureaucracy left deliberately intact and the full weight of American attention. Korea got neither. Korea got a corps that had been packing for a beach assault and an answer to be determined later. Nobody decided to shortchange Korea. That is the point. Nobody decided anything about Korea at all until it was already too late to decide it well. Hodge knew it. That is the thing that comes through most clearly in the documents. And it is the thing that changed my own view of him while I was working on this. He asked to be relieved. He warned Washington, repeatedly and in writing, about where Korea was heading and how fast. The published diplomatic record from 1947 contains his complaint that because nobody above him would publicly refute the accusation that he was failing to carry out American policy, the accusation was gaining credence, and Syngman Rhee was going to take the credit for having exposed him. His own political advisor agreed in writing the following day, observing that Hodge and the military government had become the symbols of frustration for the Korean right. Read that again, slowly. The commanding general of American forces in Korea was being publicly accused of subverting American policy by the man the United States was about to install as president, and his own government would not put out a statement backing him. Rhee eventually went further and called Hodge a communist. The general who had taken Munda and broken the Shuri Line was, by 1947, being red-baited by a client politician, while Washington stayed quiet and let it happen. The matter went to the United Nations in 1947. Elections were held in the South in May of 1948. The Republic of Korea was established on August 15, 1948, with Rai as president. Hodge left Korea on August 27, 1948. And the archival record of his departure contains one detail that I find more revealing than anything else in this entire story. The Army leadership in Washington, planning the announcement, arranged coordinated press releases across Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul, praising General Hodge's accomplishments, and the stated purpose of the coordination was to blunt unfavorable political opportunism from Rhee. In other words, the institution understood precisely what it had done to him. It understood that he was about to be publicly savaged by the government he had just finished handing a country to. And its response, after 3 years of refusing him a policy, refusing him a relief, and refusing him public support, was a press release. 3 years. No relief. a press release. What happened next is the number that ends the argument. Hodge came home and took the 5th Corps at Fort Bragg. In September of 1950, he took 3rd Army at Fort McPherson in Georgia. In 1952, he became Chief of Army Field Forces. He was promoted to full general on July 5, 1952. He retired on June 30, 1953. He died in Washington on November 12, 1963, at 70 years old, and he is buried at Arlington in Section 34. Now look at those dates again. The Korean War began on June 25, 1950. The United States Army went into a country whose terrain it did not know, whose army it had itself created, whose police force it had itself organized, whose politics it did not understand, and to whose president it had itself installed. And the one American general alive who had governed that country for 3 years, who knew the road net and the rail net and the Han River crossings, who could name the constabulary officers and knew which of them could be trusted, who had spent 1,000 days learning at first hand every single hard lesson the United States was about to relearn at a cost of 36,000 American dead, was given 3rd Army at Fort McPherson and left there. Nobody sent for him. Nobody asked. The institution that had used him up did not think to open the file. I've gone back and forth on whether that was punishment or simple institutional forgetfulness, and I have landed on forgetfulness, which I think is the more damning of the two. Punishment would at least imply that somebody was paying attention. What actually happened is that John Hodge had become, in the corporate mind of the United States Army, the Korea occupation man. And the Korea occupation was an embarrassment, and embarrassments do not get consulted. Here's what I want you to take away from this one, and it is not a defense of him. Hodge was not the best Corps commander of the Second World War. Truscott was better. Collins was better. He was not an operational thinker, and he did not find flanks. His Okinawa was a meat grinder, and he ran it without visible protest. The 27th Division's veterans had real reasons to resent him, and they carried those reasons to their graves. But, by the plainest measure available, he was one of the 2 or 3 most experienced and most reliable American Corps commanders in the Pacific. 5 campaigns across 30 months. Twice handed formations in crisis, and twice made them work. And at the end of it, 4,412 of his own men dead on a single island. The United States Army looked at that officer in August of 1945 and used him for exactly one thing, which was that his transports were closer to Korea than anybody else's. That is not politics killing competence in the usual sense. Nobody sabotaged him. Nobody stole his credit. There is no villain in this episode, and I could not manufacture one, which is precisely why I think it is the most useful story I have covered in a while. What destroyed his reputation was an institution that had no plan, no policy, no language capability, and no imagination, that assigned the hardest political problem of the post-war eras on the basis of steaming distance, that then permitted the man it had assigned to become the public face of its own failure of planning. Competence did not lose to politics here. Competence lost to nobody being in charge of anything. If your father or grandfather served in the 24th Corps, on Leyte or on Okinawa, or if he was one of the young soldiers who went ashore at Incheon in September of 1945, expecting to storm a Japanese beach and found himself directing traffic in Seoul instead, I would like to hear about it. Those stories matter, and almost none of them have been written down anywhere. Drop them in the comments. One last number, and then I am done. The 38th parallel was chosen in about 30 minutes by 2 tired colonels who could not find a river. It has now been a border for 81 years. It has outlasted the Soviet Union, every man who drew it, every man who enforced it, and the entire army that occupied it. John Hodge spent 1945 to 1948 trying to govern one side of a line that had been drawn as an administrative convenience, with a course built to invade Japan in a language nobody around him spoke, under a policy that arrived a month late and that he believed was wrong. He asked to be relieved. He was told to keep going. And when the war he had warned about finally came, nobody called. That is the story. The sources are in the description. I will see you in the next one.